I knew families could break, but I never imagined mine would shatter in a single breath. It happened the day I learned my own child decided I did not deserve a place in the moment that should have bound us forever. The sting of being pushed out, dismissed, treated as if my presence could ruin their perfect picture, it carved a wound so deep I still feel its echo. I spent years believing love meant staying quiet, staying small. But nothing prepares you for the moment when the people you gave everything to decide you are no longer needed. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're tuning in from. We love seeing how our stories connect people from all around the world. Your comments and thoughts bring this community to life, and we're so grateful to have you on this journey with us. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, grab a cozy seat, maybe a cup of coffee or tea, and prepare yourself for a tale that will captivate your heart from beginning to end. Let's begin. When I think back to how everything began, I always return to the quiet mornings at my bakery in Chatham, Massachusetts. My name is Margaret Harlow, though most people in town call me Maggie, and for more than 15 years I have lived alone in this small coastal town on Cape Cod. The mornings here carry a cold blue tint, the kind that settles on the rooftops and the water before the sun has the courage to rise. I have always liked that hour. It makes me feel as if the whole world is pausing just long enough for me to gather myself before the day starts. I open my bakery, Harlow's Hearth, at 5 o'clock each morning. I unlock the wooden door, turn on the warm lights, and breathe in the familiar scent of yeast and vanilla that never quite leaves the air. There is comfort in repetition. I mix dough, roll it out on the old pine table, shape loaves, and slide trays into the ovens while the wind chimes above the doorway rings softly whenever the ocean breeze slips through. By the time the first fishermen walk in, I already feel like I have lived a full day. They come for coffee and cinnamon rolls, always greeting me by name, always asking if I slept well. I enjoy their small kindnesses, though they rarely fill the hollow space I carry inside. Above the glass display case sits a photograph of my son Michael when he was 6 years old. He is smiling with his whole face, cheeks covered in flour from helping me bake on a Saturday morning. It is the image I cling to when I feel too far from him, a reminder that once he belonged entirely to me and I to him. After his father passed away, it was just the two of us, two people surviving under the same roof, teaching each other how to stay upright in a world that felt heavier than our shoulders could bear. I worked 2 jobs, often coming home past sunset, and Michael would sit at the kitchen table waiting for me, telling me about school, friends, and little triumphs that made his eyes shine. Those memories are stitched into the walls of my heart. Life changed when he moved across the country to San Francisco. He said it was for work, for new opportunities, for the kind of future he believed he deserved. I told him I was proud. I was. But pride and loneliness can exist side by side more often than people admit. When he met Claire, his future wife, I sensed the world shifting again. She was refined, confident, successful, and raised in a family where everything looked polished, as if nothing painful had ever dared to touch them. I never judged her, but I always felt as though she was studying me from behind glass. My neighbors see me as steady, reliable, even cheerful. They come to the bakery not only for bread but for conversation, and I try to give them all the warmth I can. Still, when I return home at night, the 2 empty chairs at my kitchen table remind me of everything I have lost and everything I'm afraid of losing. I have grown used to solitude, yet something inside me aches each time I imagine Michael building a life so far away that I have become only an occasional thought. On the afternoon that would eventually mark the beginning of everything that followed, I stood behind the bakery looking out at the gray Atlantic. The waves were calm, the air sharp with salt, and I felt both settled and unsettled at the same time. I rested my hand on the photograph of my son and whispered to myself, maybe this year will be different. I had no way of knowing that the first sign of coming trouble was already on its way toward me, quiet as the tide. If you're still watching and this moment hit you harder than you expected, comment number 1 below so I know you're still with me. Now, let's move on to chapter 2. Things are about to shift in ways no one sees coming. The afternoon light slanted through the front windows of my bakery in long golden streaks, dust drifting lazily in the quiet air as I wiped down the counter. I had just locked the door for the day when my phone buzzed across the wooden surface. Seeing Michael's name appear warmed me instantly, and I answered with the kind of anticipation only a mother feels after waiting too long to hear her child's voice. His image filled the screen, framed by bright California sun, and even before he said a word, I sensed something unusual in the way he shifted his eyes. It was slight, almost invisible, yet my heart tightened in response, the way it always does when a change is coming. He told me that Claire was pregnant. The words sent a rush of happiness through me so strong I had to grip the counter to steady myself. I had imagined this moment for years, quietly, without daring to say it aloud. I congratulated him, holding back tears while he smiled in a way that reminded me of his childhood. When the call ended, I stood in the center of the empty bakery and let the joy settle into every corner of me. That night, I pulled out a basket of soft blue yarn and began knitting a blanket, each stitch a promise of love for a grandchild I had not yet met. For a few days, the world felt brighter. But then Michael called again. His voice held a careful politeness that told me he was choosing words rather than simply speaking them. He explained that Claire wanted a private birth. She wanted only her side of the family present. The phrase lingered in the air around me long after the call ended. Only her family. I repeated the words silently, trying to convince myself that it was not meant to exclude me, that it was only about comfort or preference. Even so, something in me sagged. I pressed my palms against the kitchen counter, waiting for the ache in my chest to fade. My attempts to reach out to Claire grew more delicate after that. I sent her photos of the blanket progressing, along with gentle questions about how she was feeling. She replied with brief messages, polite but distant, as though I were someone she needed to acknowledge but not invite in. When I called, she often let it ring. I told myself she must be tired, busy, overwhelmed with work, and I refused to let insecurity take root. Still, when she posted glowing photographs of her pregnancy online, surrounded by smiling friends and relatives, I felt like a stranger peering into a celebration through a window I was not meant to approach. Michael's calls also changed. They became shorter, rushed, punctuated by background noise and excuses. He sounded distracted, and although he insisted everything was fine, I recognized the subtle tension in his voice. He was keeping conversations on the surface, avoiding anything that might drift into deeper water. I missed the way he used to talk to me, unguarded and eager, but I swallowed my sadness and reminded myself that adulthood pulls children away in ways no one prepares mothers for. I continued knitting the blanket, letting the rhythm of the needles calm me. Ruthie noticed the shift in my mood and pressed gently for answers, but I only smiled and told her I was tired. She frowned in that way she does when she knows I'm hiding something, yet she did not push. As I worked, a faint sense of unease followed me around the bakery, settling beside me like a quiet shadow. One evening, as the sky turned a deep violet over Cape Cod, I sat alone in the darkened shop, the nearly finished blanket folded in my lap. The room was silent, except for the distant sound of waves rolling against the shore. I traced my fingers along the soft yarn and tried to ignore the feeling that something was slipping out of my reach. I wanted to believe everything would fall into place when the baby arrived. But even then, long before the real heartbreak unfolded, I sensed that that the first crack in our family had already begun to form. If you're still watching and starting to sense the tension building beneath the surface, comment number 2 below to let me know you feel it too. Now, let's head into chapter 3, where the calm finally breaks. I still remember the sharp scent of eucalyptus drifting through the courtyard the afternoon Michael married Claire. San Francisco had that strange mix of fog and sunshine, the kind that wrapped the city in a soft glow that should have felt magical. But the entire day unfolded like I was watching it from behind a pane of glass. As Michael's mother, I had imagined something different, something warm and familiar. Instead, I stepped into a world I barely recognized, filled with polished marble floors, minimalist flower arrangements, and guests who looked like they had stepped out of magazine photographs. Even the air felt expensive. The first moment I sensed I did not belong was when the wedding coordinator led me to my seat. I stood there smiling politely while she pointed to a chair near the back, 3 rows behind Claire's extended family and just a few seats away from a group of co-workers I had never met. I told myself it was a simple mistake, that seating charts were complicated, that someone must have overlooked a detail. But when I saw Claire's parents surrounded by relatives, all seated up front with care and intention, something inside me tightened. I tried not to dwell on it. This was Michael's big day, and I refused to let my hurt overshadow his happiness. I had spent weeks embroidering a wedding gift, a soft cream-colored table runner with ocean waves stitched along the edges, each thread holding a piece of home. Cape Cod was my heart, and I wanted to give Michael something that carried that piece of him he had left behind. When I handed the wrapped gift to Claire, she offered a brief smile, thanked me in a tone so light it barely skimmed the surface of politeness, and passed it to her assistant without opening it. I watched the package disappear into a pile of bags and boxes. My hands felt cold after that. Throughout the reception, I tried weaving myself into conversations, but Claire's relatives spoke of international vacations, business opportunities, and investment properties. They were courteous enough, but their eyes drifted past me, toward people they preferred. I sat quietly for long stretches, listening to laughter ripple through the crowd while my presence went unnoticed. Guests even mistook me for event staff twice. I corrected them softly each time, but the embarrassment clung to me like damp fog. Michael darted by often, offering a quick squeeze of my shoulder or a fleeting smile before someone called his name and swept him away again. I could see the guilt in his eyes each time he noticed me sitting alone. He wanted to fix it, but he did not know how, and I did not want to burden him on the day he was supposed to look forward to a new beginning. Near sunset, I stood at the edge of the courtyard while the photographer gathered everyone for the family portrait. I waited for my name to be called, but it never was. I watched from a distance as they posed, glowing under the string lights. My son looked radiant, and I clung to that image even as I felt myself fading from the frame. On the flight back to Cape Cod, I held the embroidered runner in my lap, the fabric a quiet reminder of the distance growing between us. I told myself things would get better. I told myself a grandchild would soften the edges. But deep down, I sensed this was only the beginning. If you're still watching, and the first cracks in this family story surprised you, comment number 3 below, so I know you're following every beat. Now, let's move into chapter 4, where the effort to fix things only makes them worse. When I returned to Cape Cod after the wedding, the familiar rhythm of home wrapped around me with its quiet predictability. The ocean still murmured beyond the dunes, the morning air still smelled faintly of salt and rising dough, and the bakery still opened each day with the same gentle clatter of trays and mixing bowls. But something inside me felt unsettled, as if the distance between Massachusetts and California had grown larger than any map could measure. I tried to shake it off, telling myself new marriages were delicate, that young couples needed time to build their own foundation. I convinced myself that I only needed to reach across the gap with patience and warmth. Every Saturday evening, after closing the bakery, I prepared a small box filled with almond waffle cookies and cinnamon twists. I lined the bottom with parchment paper, slipped a handwritten note on top, and mailed it to Michael and Claire in San Francisco. I pictured them opening the package together, the smell of vanilla drifting out and softening whatever stress filled their week. Sometimes I added a ribbon around the box just to make it feel more thoughtful. It made me feel connected to them in a way words could not. I began calling Michael more often, using a cheerful tone even on days when exhaustion weighed on my shoulders. He answered, but never for long. There was always something pulling at him. He was running late for a meeting, or he needed to review blueprints, or Claire had planned something for the evening. Each call ended sooner than I hoped, leaving behind an ache I tried to ignore. I reminded myself that his life was changing rapidly, and I did not want to cling so tightly that he felt smothered. One afternoon, I assembled a larger package for their new apartment. I stitched a set of cotton kitchen towels with small seashell patterns that reminded me of home. I added a jar of homemade apple jam, the recipe passed down from my grandmother. And last, I placed a wooden picture frame holding a photograph of Michael at 5 years old, standing proudly with a toy sailboat. I wrapped everything carefully and mailed it with a hopeful heart. When Michael replied several days later, his message was brief. He said the gift was thoughtful, though Claire felt the apartment was becoming too cluttered. There was no note from Claire, not even a single sentence. Still, I kept trying. I suggested a video call once a week, imagining the three of us talking about ordinary things. But each time Michael said he would have to check with Claire, and somehow the call never happened. When we did speak, he sounded distracted, as if his mind was already somewhere else. I filled the silence by telling him stories from the bakery, about Ruthie's latest attempt at reorganizing the shelves, or the tourist couple who bought an entire tray of muffins. He laughed politely, but the warmth was missing. Each call left a faint hollowness in my chest. Eventually, Michael confessed that Claire wanted more space. She was stressed with work and felt overwhelmed. I told him I understood, even though the words settled heavily inside me like wet sand. I promised myself I would back away gently. A week later, a young woman named Jenna walked into the bakery. She was visiting Cape Cod and mentioned she worked for an architecture firm in San Francisco. When I heard the name of Claire's company, I smiled and casually mentioned my daughter-in-law. Jenna froze for a moment and then said that Claire had often complained about feeling pressured by her future mother-in-law. She spoke without malice, unaware of the wound she had opened. I stood there behind the counter, pretending her words had not pierced straight through me. That evening, I sat alone in the bakery after closing. The lights dimmed and the trays washed and stacked. A small box of cookies sat on the counter, ready to be mailed, but I could not bring myself to tape it shut. I rested my hands on the cool metal surface and let the silence settle around me. Something deep inside whispered a warning, soft but persistent. I realized then that no matter how much I tried, the distance between us was not shrinking. It was widening, quietly and steadily, like a tide pulling away from shore. If you're still watching and the emotional distance is starting to sting a little, comment number 4 below so I know you're feeling it too. Now, let's step into chapter 5. And trust me, this is where everything explodes. The morning the world seemed to tilt off its axis began like any other. I was arranging trays of warm cranberry scones behind the bakery counter, letting the steam rise against my face, when my phone vibrated sharply against the metal shelf. Michael's name appeared, and before I even answered, a ripple of nerves moved through me. His voice trembled as he told me Claire had gone into labor early. For a moment, the entire room brightened, as if someone had pulled open all the windows at once. My heart pounded with an excitement I had held in for months. I had imagined this call so many times, and finally it was here. Without hesitation, I locked the bakery door and called Ruthie to take over for a few days. I moved around my house in a blur, grabbing the soft gray sweater I saved for important moments, the notebook where I wrote letters to my future grandchild, and the blanket I had spent weeks knitting. I folded it gently and tucked it into my bag. It felt like carrying a piece of my heart. At the bus station, snow flurries drifted lazily across the pavement. I stood near the curb clutching my ticket when my phone rang again. This time Michael's voice was strained, each word stiff and unnatural. He said Claire wanted only family in the delivery room. For a second I was confused. I asked what he meant, and his answer landed like a blow I could feel in my bones. Claire meant her family, not his, not me. The world around me seemed to fall silent. I stared at the cold ground, trying to make sense of what I had heard. I asked if Claire was all right. I asked if he was all right. I asked if he truly meant for me to stay home. He stumbled through excuses about stress and chaos and the hospital being crowded, but none of his explanations softened the truth. When he repeated that Claire wanted only her side of the family, I felt something inside me go still, the way the ocean becomes eerily calm just before a storm breaks. I told him I understood, though my voice trembled. After the call ended, I sank onto the metal bench at the bus stop. The blanket rested across my lap, the soft yarn pressing against my palms. I thought about all the nights I stayed awake sewing patches on Michael's clothes, baking for school fundraisers, covering his growing feet with blankets in winter. I thought of the day he moved across the country and how part of me feared that distance would take him further than miles. Now that fear had unfolded into reality. The bus pulled in, its engine rumbling in the cold air. I stood and stepped aboard because a small flicker inside me insisted that I had to be there, even if I was not allowed into the room. During the long ride west, I kept my eyes on the window, watching scenery blur into white streaks. I held my phone in my hand as if hoping it would ring again with different news. Halfway through the journey, a notification appeared. It was from a group chat I did not recognize. Someone must have added my number by mistake. I opened it and froze. A friend of Claire had written that Claire finally had the birth she wanted, free from interference, with only her own people present. Reading the words felt like being pierced clean through. I sat motionless while the bus continued down the highway, the hum of tires drowning beneath the pounding of my heart. The shame, the shock, the betrayal, all of it surged at once. I pressed my hand to my mouth, forcing back the wave of tears. I felt foolish for believing Claire simply needed space, foolish for thinking kindness would be enough. But worst of all was the realization that Michael had not defended me. He had chosen silence over loyalty. The sky darkened as the bus drove deeper into the night. I rested my hand on the knitted blanket and let the quiet grief settle heavily inside me. Somewhere in the distance, my grandson was entering the world, and I was traveling toward him with hope fractured but not yet extinguished. As the road stretched out before me, I understood that nothing between us would ever be the same again. The bus hummed steadily through the darkness, its windows reflecting long streaks of highway lights that rose and fell like waves. I sat pressed against the cold glass, the knitted blanket resting across my knees. My hands kept smoothing the yarn without meaning to, as if the motion itself could keep me from unraveling. The storm of emotions inside me had quieted into something heavier, something that felt like silence after a long cry. I was exhausted, not from the travel, but from the realization that the people I loved most had pushed me out of one of the most sacred moments of their lives. For a fleeting second, I considered stepping off the bus at the next stop, buying a return ticket home, and retreating to the safety of Cape Cod. It would be so easy to disappear into my routines again, to bury my hurt beneath batches of dough and trays of pastries. But the thought of never seeing my grandson struck me with such force that I had to close my eyes. He had just taken his first breath somewhere far ahead on this road, and whether or not his parents wanted me there, my heart yearned for him. This trip was no longer about Claire or Michael. It was about a child who did not choose any of this. I lifted the blanket to my face and pressed my cheek against the soft stitches. I remembered the evenings I spent knitting it, imagining the way I would wrap it around a tiny body, imagining the warmth I hoped to give. Every loop of yarn held a promise I was not ready to break. That promise kept me moving forward. As the bus wove through a mountain curve, I took a deep breath and pulled out my phone. A part of me wanted answers. Another part wanted clarity, even if the truth hurt. I called the hospital in San Francisco, politely asking for Claire's condition and whether they needed an alternate emergency contact if anything changed. The nurse checked the file and told me, without hesitation, that I was already listed as the primary emergency contact. My heart lurched. I thanked her calmly, hung up, and stared at the darkened aisle of the bus. Why would Claire keep me listed in such an essential role and still bar me from the room where my grandson was born? Nothing made sense. I called Michael to tell him what the hospital had said. His irritation poured through the speaker before I finished my sentence. He insisted I should not meddle and that Claire needed peace, not interference. Not once did he ask where I was, how I was feeling, or why I had called. His tone was clipped, impatient, as if my very existence complicated their lives. When he said I was adding stress, something inside me snapped, not in anger, but in clarity. I ended the call gently, not trusting myself to speak further. As the road stretched ahead, my thoughts ran through the past months like a film. The ignored messages, the brief replies, the lack of gratitude, the wedding where I was treated like a stranger. What once looked like isolated misunderstandings now formed a pattern, a steady pushing away masked as politeness. I had spent years giving, hoping, and forgiving without question. Somewhere along the way, I had forgotten to protect myself. The bus stopped at a rest station for 10 minutes. I stepped outside into the cold air, letting the wind sting my cheeks awake. Overhead, the sky was pitch black, vast and unbroken. I lifted my chin and breathed deeply, letting the truth settle inside me. I could not control how Michael and Claire treated me, but I could control how I responded. I could choose to stop shrinking myself in their presence. I could choose to stand straighter. When I returned to my seat, I sat with my spine lifted, my hands steady around the blanket. I was still going to San Francisco. I would see my grandson, even if only from a distance. But I would not beg for a place I was not given. I would not bend until I disappeared. The bus rumbled back onto the highway, and for the first time since the ordeal began, I felt something like resolve bloom quietly in my chest. The true confrontation had not happened yet, but I knew without doubt that I would meet it on my terms. If you're still watching, and that turning point left you breathless, comment number 6 below to let me know you're holding on. Now, let's move to Chapter 7, where the consequences hit harder than anyone expects. A full year passed after the day my grandson came into the world without me there to welcome him. In that time, the season along Cape Cod shifted quietly from winter to spring, then to the heavy warmth of summer, and eventually back to the biting wind of another winter. The bakery continued to open each morning, the ovens glowing as they always had, and customers still greeted me with their usual warmth. But inside, something in me had faded. The lively spark I once carried into every conversation became muted, and even Ruthie noticed the difference. She would linger after closing time, gently nudging me to talk, but I only offered small, practiced smiles. The worst part of that year was the silence. I received no updates about Lucas, no photographs, no calls, not even a message meant to soften the blow of my absence. I watched other families stroll into the bakery with toddlers tugging at their coats, and each time my chest tightened. I tried to ignore the ache, but grief has a way of finding cracks in even the strongest habits. Sometimes I would scroll through social media late at night, only to stumble upon glimpses of Claire's world. Lucas blowing out a single candle on a tiny cake, Claire pushing a stroller through a park, Michael standing beside them with a stiff smile. None of those moments were meant for me. I was an outsider, observing a life that should have included me. I drowned myself in work to fill the hollow space. I accepted larger catering orders, baked late into the night, and experimented with new recipes just to keep my hands busy. Customers praised my dedication, but they did not see the exhaustion behind it. Ruthie tried to coax me out of my self-imposed shell, inviting me to community gatherings and beach bonfires, but each time I declined. I told her the bakery needed me, but the truth was simpler. I did not know how to exist without the family I had imagined. While I was sinking deeper into routine, life in San Francisco was unraveling in ways I did not know. Michael's job contract ended abruptly after a project failure, leaving him scrambling for new work. Claire, who had been struggling quietly since Lucas was born, fell into a deeper form of postpartum depression. She experienced sleepless nights, bursts of fear, and a loss of connection with the baby. The weight of caring for Lucas, combined with financial strain, pushed Michael to the edge of his limits. Their life became a series of emergencies stitched together with exhaustion. One cold morning, as I arranged trays of muffins for the first customers of the day, my phone rang with a number from California. I nearly ignored it, assuming it was a telemarketer, but something in my chest told me to answer. The voice on the other end introduced herself from the Family and Child Services Department of San Francisco. Hearing that name sent a jolt through me. She explained that I was still listed as the emergency guardian for Claire, and by law they were required to inform me that Lucas needed temporary supervision while Claire received medical treatment. She spoke gently, but every word felt like a small earthquake beneath my feet. The shock had not even settled when Michael called. His voice trembled in a way I had never heard before. He confessed everything: Claire's struggles, his job loss, the chaos swallowing their home. He admitted he could not do it alone. For a moment, I could not speak. This was the same son who once told me to stay away, who accepted my absence at the birth of his child. Now, he was reaching for me with the desperation of a drowning man. As I stood there, staring out at the gray morning light filtering through the bakery window, I felt both wounded and fiercely protective. No part of me wanted revenge. What I felt was something deeper, a call to step into my rightful place, not with pleading, but with the steadiness I had always carried inside. The consequences of the past year had finally converged, and I knew I could not turn away from them. I woke the next morning to the gray light that always creeps over Cape Cod before sunrise. The bakery was still cold, the oven silent, and for a long moment, I just stood in the center of the kitchen, palms flat against the wooden counter. The ache from the night before still lingered, but beneath it something steadier had begun to form. It was not anger. It was not even grief. It was clarity. Lucas needed someone who was not drowning. Claire needed time to heal. And Michael needed someone who would not fall apart in front of him. I breathed in the smell of flour and salt, then straightened my shoulders. It was time to move. I shut the bakery early, leaving a note for Ruthie explaining only that I had a family emergency. I packed with careful intention, not the frantic desperation of the trip years ago. A few clothes, the knitted blanket I had made for Lucas, the photograph of Michael as a boy that had once reminded me only of loss, and an empty notebook whose first page I hoped would one day hold a different ending. I locked the front door with a steadiness I had not felt in months. San Francisco greeted me with its familiar wind, the kind that carries the scent of the bay mixed with the metallic taste of the city. When I saw Michael waiting outside the hospital, I barely recognized him. His posture slumped, his clothes wrinkled, his face hollowed by nights without rest. He murmured a greeting, barely lifting his eyes, and I simply nodded. There was no need for speeches. We had too much to do. Inside, the social worker explained the situation methodically. Lucas needed temporary care, someone stable and cleared on record. Because my name had already been listed, I was the most immediate option. I listened without interrupting, my hands folded in my lap. For the first time in a long while, I chose not to act from hurt. I asked for details instead, timeframes, responsibilities, legal boundaries. I would help, but I would not disappear into sacrifice the way I once did. Before taking Lucas, I asked to see Claire. She looked nothing like the composed woman I had met years ago. Her hair was unwashed, her eyes swollen, and her voice trembled even in seconds. When she saw me, her shoulders curled inward as if bracing for judgment. I sat beside her and rested my hand on hers. She whispered that she felt like she was failing, that she had pushed me away because she had feared I would see right through her. I told her she needed to focus on healing, not proving anything. Her tears were quiet, but they carried more honesty than any words we had ever exchanged. Lucas was smaller than I expected when they placed him in my arms. His fingers curled instinctively around mine, warm and impossibly delicate. Holding him did not fill the emptiness inside me, but it reminded me that some things were still worth fighting for. Outside, Michael waited anxiously, and for once he allowed the silence between us to be real instead of evasive. When he finally spoke, his apology came out fractured. Listened, then told him the truth. I would help, but I would no longer step into chaos without conditions. Later, as we reviewed paperwork, I discovered the financial mess he had tried to hide. The failed business loan, the debts, the reckless trust in someone who had vanished when things collapsed. He admitted everything, with the exhaustion of a man who had run out of places to hide. I told him honesty was the price for my support. That night, in a small rented apartment, I held Lucas against my chest while the city hummed outside. I opened my notebook and wrote on the first page, before the ink could hesitate, "This time, I choose myself too." If you're still watching and the shift in power has you leaning in, comment number 8 below, so I know you're ready for the finale. Now, let's move on to the ending, where everything finally comes full circle. The weeks I spent caring for Lucas in San Francisco moved quietly, almost gently, as if life itself was trying to mend what had been broken. Each morning began with the soft weight of Lucas in my arms, his breath warm against my shoulder, while the city stirred awake outside the apartment windows. I had arrived feeling like a stranger in this family, but slowly, something steadier and more rooted began to take shape. Michael changed first. He approached me without defensiveness, without the fragile pride that once kept him distant. He admitted the mistakes he had spent years avoiding, not in a grand apology, but in the small, consistent ways he showed up. He cooked simple meals, cleaned without being asked, and stayed present as I taught him how to soothe Lucas during restless evenings. The man who once pushed me away now stood beside me, trying to rebuild what he had almost destroyed. Claire emerged from her treatment looking fragile, but honest. One afternoon, she asked to speak quietly, and her voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had finally faced her own shadows. She confessed her fear of becoming a mother who wounded instead of nurtured, a fear that had driven her to isolate herself and see threats where none existed. I listened without judgment. I told her that I would support her, but I would no longer accept being treated as someone unworthy of a place in this family. She nodded with genuine understanding. Lucas became the quiet bridge between all of us. He reached for me with growing familiarity, his eyes bright with recognition each time I whispered his name. Caring for him healed parts of me I thought had permanently dimmed. For the first time since the painful distance began, I felt seen again, not through apologies or promises, but through the small hand that trusted mine. When it was time for me to return to Cape Cod, the apartment felt different. It felt warmer, lived in, grounded. Michael carried my suitcase to the door, and Lucas leaned toward me, arms lifted in a gesture that tightened my chest. As I stepped outside into the fading light, I realized I was no longer walking away as someone abandoned. I was leaving as a woman who had reclaimed her dignity, her strength, and her place in the world. When I returned to Cape Cod, the familiar scent of the ocean met me before I even stepped off the bus. The bakery sat exactly as I had left it, warm lights glowing against the early morning mist. Yet something inside me had shifted. For the first time in years, the space did not feel lonely. It felt like mine again, steady and whole. As I unlocked the door, I realized how different I had become. I was no longer the woman who waited by the phone, hoping for scraps of affection. I was no longer the mother who believed love meant enduring any wound. I had walked through one of the hardest seasons of my life and discovered that survival alone was not enough. I needed to claim my worth. Looking back, the pain came not only from being pushed away, but from believing that silence and self-erasure were the price of belonging. Setting boundaries had felt terrifying at first, but in the end, those boundaries saved me. They taught my son how to approach me with respect. They showed Claire that I would no longer accept being treated as invisible. And they reminded me that a woman's value is not defined by how much she bears quietly. Lucas remained the bright thread in all of it, proof that love rooted in presence grows stronger than any hurt. When I picture his small hands reaching for me, I know I chose the right path. Now, each morning when sunlight spills across the bakery counter, I feel a quiet freedom. I have learned that loving others deeply is possible without losing myself. And that lesson, earned through struggle, is the one I hold closest as I begin the next chapter of my life. There are seasons in every life that test the quiet strength we did not know we carried. There are losses that carve space inside us, only so something wiser and steadier can take root. And there are moments when we finally understand that love is not measured by how much we endure, but by how deeply we honor our own worth. Healing often arrives in small, subtle ways: a steadier breath, a clearer boundary, a softer heart that no longer bows to guilt. In the end, peace is not something given. It is something claimed, one honest choice at a time. Thank you for staying with this journey. If this story touched something in you, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice may be the light someone else needs. And if you would like to follow more stories like this, please like, subscribe, and stay connected.